Hi, welcome to Group E's presentation on Dimension 3. My name is Travis, and I'll be going through some of the introductory parts of Dimension 3. Now, the focus of Dimension 3 is on building skills of researching evidence and making claims using them. Students will analyze information and hopefully come to their own conclusions. What's interesting about this dimension is that students of all skill levels are capable of understanding, because no matter how old or how young the student is, they understand that if they're going to make a claim, that they need evidence to back it up. Dimension 3 will use a variety of technology, meaning that students will be able to use all sorts of different technology to find their information, whether it be books, internet, or more. And Dimension 3 is important because it supports the examination of content from multiple social science disciplines. Now, the first part of Dimension 3 is gathering and evaluating sources. Students should be able to gather information from a wide variety of sources. Now, these sources may come from different places, such as they may be researched by the students individually, or they could be given by the teacher. They'll identify the value of the source using their Common Core literacy skills. For example, they'll identify the purpose, main ideas, and point of view of the piece. And gradually, they'll build on the number of sources and how they will analyze them. So for example, if we turn to the expectations, by second grade, students should be gathering relevant information from one or two sources while using the origin and structure to guide their selection. They should also evaluate a source by distinguishing between fact and opinion. In fifth grade, students would be able to gather information from multiple sources using origin, structure, and context, and then determine the credibility of the piece by looking at fact and opinion. In eighth grade, students should gather information from multiple sources using origin, structure, context, and corroborative value. So now taking multiple sources and building them together. And they should evaluate the credibility of the piece by looking at its relevance and intent. And finally, by 12th grade, when they're graduating, students should gather information from multiple sources representing a wide range of views, and they should evaluate the credibility of the source by examining how experts value the source. Now let me pass it over to Tommy, who will go on to the next part. Thank you.
So Dimension 3 is called Evaluating Sources and Using Evidence because this skill set comes in two parts. Travis already talked about how the first part is gathering and evaluating sources, but I'm Tommy and I'm here to talk about the other side of that coin, which is developing claims and using evidence that comes from the sources you've gathered. So to do this, Dimension 3 talks about a source-to-evidence relationship. Students need to understand this relationship because it's basically what it sounds like. The relationship between the claims you're developing or the counterclaims you're developing and the evidence that you've selected to support those claims. Obviously, the evidence you select from sources needs to relate to the claims that you're making. So, as this is understood, students should be able to build toward using more claims from more sources, or more information from more sources to build in the sophistication of the claims they're able to make. And when they're able to make more sophisticated claims, it means they're able to respond to more compelling questions. So when they understand what a claim is, that also helps them know when they need to build the evidence they're using, because sometimes claims are implicit and sometimes they're explicit. So whether they're implicit or explicit in their work, students should know how to draw more evidence from sources to back them up and when to do that. So Dimension 3 also outlines expectations for how these skills develop over time in students. It says that these skills largely begin from grades 3 to 5, and by the end of 5th grade, students should be able to at least identify evidence drawing from multiple sources, and then use that evidence to develop claims that respond to compelling questions. So in its most basic form, students are able to use evidence to make claims. By the end of 8th grade, it says that this skill should extend to the point of being able to do this, but also point out strengths and limitations of claims and counterclaims. So these can be claims that they're making or counterclaims that they're encountering, and pointing out the strengths and limitations of them. By the end of 12th grade, this extends again to not only pointing out the strengths and limitations, but being able to detect inconsistencies in order to revise, strengthen, or refine the claims that you're engaging with. So this skill is then used to make your claims or counterclaims more precise, significant, and knowledgeable. So these are the things that Dimension 3 lays out for developing claims and using evidence. And I think this skill set is pretty ubiquitous in history and social science classrooms because, for example, even the appeasement lesson plan that we sampled a couple weeks ago was all about having students delve into primary sources to take out evidence from that information and use it to back up claims that they were to hold and defend in dialogue with other students. So it's easy to see how these kinds of skills can be relevant across HSS in all grades.
English Language Arts Literacy Common Core Connections Dimension 3. The ELA Literacy Common Core Standards focus broadly on evaluating sources and using evidence as skills that are fundamental to success in college and career. In other words, we want our students evaluating the sources. We want them to question the who, what, when, where, how. Where is this document coming from? Who is the author of this article? Students need the ability to gather, comprehend, evaluate, synthesize, and report on information and ideas. We want our students to focus on gathering and reporting, as well as having conversations with one another. Because they are ELA students, we want them practicing the language, we want to make sure that they are comprehending the material, and we also want to make sure that they're grasping the content vocabulary. The ELA Literacy Common Core Standards also make clear students must reflexively demonstrate the cogent, clear, or logical reasoning and use of evidence that is essential to both private deliberation and responsible citizenship in a democratic republic. In other words, we want our students to be able to think for themselves. Connections between the C3 framework and the college and career readiness anchor standards. The anchor reading standards 1 through 10 are closely aligned with Dimension 3. For example, Reading Standards 1 requires students to cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking. This skill is an important part of evaluating the credibility of a source, something that the C3 framework calls on students to do in Dimension 3. The C3 framework assumes a collaborative environment as students work through their inquiries. As students gather and evaluate sources for relevant information and determine credibility toward building claims with evidence, they should have multiple opportunities to practice civil, democratic discourse with diverse partners. Once again, we really want to encourage our students to learn how to think on their own and make their own civil decisions. A way that we can use this within our curriculum is cited on Table 3. It's actually Table 27. I'm not sure why it came up as Table 3, but this is a way that we can go ahead and cite it within our lesson planning.
The last part of Dimension 3 goes over the language it shares with the ELA Literacy Common Core Standards. It's important to note this so we can understand the similarities and the differences between the terminology and the way that it's used. And this can help us make sure that we are following both guidelines and that we can understand them well. So, the similar terms include argument, sources, claims, evidence, counterclaims, gather, and they are both concerned with plagiarism and proper citation of sources. On the differences side, CC is a Common Core and the C3 is the California C3 framework. So the Common Core standards emphasize the skill of argumentation, especially for college and career readiness. And for grades K through 5, they use the term opinion as opposed to argument, which the C3 framework uses for K through 12 in its entirety. They also use sources and gather with regard to location, evaluation, making claims, and using evidence. And they also distinguish sources, for example, print versus digital, and the like. And the last difference of the C3 framework is that they make distinctions between primary and secondary sources more explicitly than the Common Core.